Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today we are going over the top 10 best books for me this year. And this was actually kind of hard to do because this year I gave 27 books 5 stars. I liked a lot of books this year. Actually, I felt like this year was overall like not as good as last year. Like the quality of the books were lower, but I think as far as like volume, I ended up giving more books 5 stars, but I still don't feel like a lot of these are going to be like favorites of all time. Anyway, before I get into my top 10 books of the year, I do want to go through the honorable mentions of all the books that I gave 5 stars, at least reading them the first time. I am just going to list the books and put the covers here. I am not going to talk about the books at all, and these are in absolutely no particular order. I think they're in the order that Goodreads listed them, so probably the date I read them, or reverse something, whatever. The first honorable mention is the entirety of the Wayfarer series. I have given every single book in the Wayfarer series 5 stars, but A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet was my favorite of the Wayfarer books, but I read that in 2020. So I didn't feel right putting any of the other Wayfarer books in the top 10 because my favorite in the series was something that I didn't read this year. But they're all 5-star books. Also, the Murderbot Diaries. Every book that I've read in the Murderbot Diaries has been 5 stars. Then The Berry Giant by Kazu Ishiguro. Hood Feminism by, I don't remember. I don't have the authors' names written here, so if I don't remember the authors' names, the cover will just be here. It happens. A Life on Our Planet by David Attenborough. The Crown of Gilded Bones by Jennifer L. Armentrout. A Man and His Cat. I don't remember who the author is. The Calculating Stars and the Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal. Tower of Dawn and Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. Before the Coffee Gets Cold by, I don't remember. And A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. Now, let's get into the actual top 10 countdown. And we are going to start off with When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. Now, this was by far the best thriller that I read all year. And a lot of people were like, oh, it's not really a thriller, it's too slow paced, it's kind of a horror more than a thriller. Dude, this was a thriller. And this was so good, especially because I hate thrillers, because it wasn't really a domestic thriller, and it was terrifying because the things that happen in this book kind of actually happen to real people. What do you do when your neighbors are vanishing and you're terrified for your life, but calling the police is just going to make it worse? Like, I can't imagine that situation, and the thought of not having the law on my side with all of like my white girl privilege is such a terrifying aspect. And to know that that really happens to people, like modern times in the United States, where you can't trust the people who are supposed to be there to protect you because they're racist, is just horrifying. And every little encounter of this book, knowing that not all, but a lot of the things in this book actually happen or could happen, and there's nothing, like the powerlessness of dealing with these things was just so terrifying that it was one of those like quiet thrillers because it could happen. The end of it got a little silly, but I enjoyed it. It got to a point where it became very unrealistic, but it was still an enjoyable story. And I think it brought in a little bit of lightheartedness to what otherwise would have just been a very, very depressing book based off of the realistic nature of it. So highly, highly recommend this, but don't go into it expecting like a traditional like domestic thriller type thing. Number 9 is Network Effect by Martha Wells. So Network Effect is book 5 in the Murderbot Diaries, and this is the only full-length novel thus far in the Murderbot Diaries. I liked this one because it had art in it, and art and Murderbot together for a full-length novel is everything. This is ridiculous. It are two like sarcastic asshole characters being sarcastic assholes to each other in a sci-fi setting with social anxiety, and oh my god, I love Murderbot. I adore Murderbot. I adore everything ever to exist about Murderbot. So I don't know what else to say about this. It's the 5th book in a series. It's hard to describe the book. I'm just telling you that art and Murderbot together in a full-length novel is everything that I ever needed in my life, and it makes me unreasonably happy. So this book makes my top 10 books of the year list. Next up at number 8, I am putting a Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. And this book was not even on my radar. Like, I'd seen the cover and I was like, oh, that's a really cute cover, but I went into this book completely blind. It was on the Goodreads Choice Awards for science fiction, top 10, and I was just reading them. Like, I didn't check premises of any of these books or anything like that. I was just like, I'm reading the Goodreads sci-fi top 10. This is one of them. Okay. So basically what this is a woman makes a deal with the devil, and she has 7 years each to find 7 souls to replace her soul in hell, in order to, you know, not go to hell. And she is a violin teacher, and so she has 7 students. She has 7 years per student, so 49 years. And she has produced 6 students so far, and she has 1 year left in the 7th year for the 7th student. And she needs to find the just cherry on this top of perfect souls to send to hell. And the girl she ends up picking is just not what anybody expects. And instead of picking some sort of traditional child violin prodigy, she finds a just passionate trans girl who is homeless, but has like a certain ear for violin. And she can like listen to a song and play it back and make you feel what she's feeling. And this whole book is just this relationship between a constantly abused, beautiful young trans girl who is just trying to survive and find some joy in a world that just hates her for doing nothing except for existing, and this woman who is supposed to sell this girl's soul. Did you have a good walk? And while that already sounds like a fantastic story by itself, we're also gonna throw in a space alien who runs a donut shop in LA. Why? Who knows? But it was fantastic. Next up at number 7 is Stamped by Ibram X. Kennedy and Jason Reynolds. And this is a remix of Stamped from the Beginning, which is an adult novel about just racism in America. But Stamped is remixed for a teenage audience, and I think this is like the perfect blend of interesting and factual for a teenage mind. Like, this isn't just a boring history or like a textbook. This is a story that is targeted towards Black teenagers, and it is beautifully, beautifully written. And I don't know if that's Ibram X. Kennedy or if that was Jason Reynolds who made this historical books so conversational. But this is one of the most interesting historical educational books that I read all year, and I highly recommend it. I plan in 2022 hopefully to get 2 stamps from the beginning so I can compare the 2 of them, but at least the young adult take on this was fantastic, and I highly recommend it. Next up at number 6, I'm going to put The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. And this is a somewhat classical horror story. This was published, I don't know when this was published. This was published in 1983, so it's not really much of a classic because it's about the same age that I am. God, I'm old. Anyway, older horror story, 80s horror story, and this is one of the very, very few horror books that actually terrified the shit out of me. And that is so rare that that reason alone, it earned a spot in my best books of the year. But yeah, creepy little kids screaming apparently terrifies me in book form, but love Susan Hill's writing. Creepy story. I saw the movie a couple of years ago and I didn't think the movie was any more particularly scary than most horror movies, but the book was especially terrifying. So if you want actually scary horror, might I recommend this for you. Next up at number 5, I have This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal et Matar. I don't know if I pronounced their name correctly. Whatever. This is one of those books that's just super freaking weird that I apparently love, that's very, very hard to describe. This is like a futuristic sci-fi type book where you've got spies on either side of this galactic battle, one red, one blue, and they kind of travel through different points in time in order to win the time war, and they can see the future and see the past, and they do like little things to change the future, but like they can't really change it that much because they could just go back and change it again. Very, very confusing, but it's a love story, and these 2 different spies, or intelligence agents, because they're not really spying on anything. They're like actively trying to screw up these 2 people, agents, like have conversation with each other and like write letters to each other and kind of end up falling in love through screwing with each other at the war. It's very weird, very hard to understand, definitely not for everyone, but if you want a completely weird, absurd sapphic romance, highly, highly recommend this one. Next up at number 4, Sarland by Rivers Solomon, and this is a lot of the same things that I said for the last book. It's weird and it's sapphic. Basically, this woman is part of a cult. She was raised in a cult, and she's impregnated against her will, and she runs away right as she's about to give birth, has birth in the forest, and raises her 2 twin babies as like feral children in the wild. And there's like these mystical elements to the book, and you can't really tell if she's hallucinating or if like magical things are happening. And you know what, it might be a little bit of both, but it's weird, it's wild, very sapphic, very non-binary, And there's some really interesting rep in here. I enjoyed it, but again, I don't think this is for everybody, but this is one of those books that I think everybody should read and experience. Like, the wildly weird that you can find in different places in literature. Next up at number 3 is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Now, this book I think I might like more than it deserves because it was set in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where I lived for many years. And it was also set in the 90s, so there's a lot of pop culture references that resonated with me. This is basically about a bunch of rich white girls in the 80s, or not, I think it might have been the 80s now that I've just said this, like 80s, 90s in South Carolina, and one girl gets possessed by the devil. And it's just, it's silly, but also at the same time, it's very poignant. And this is one of the books that doesn't sugarcoat problematic content from the time period where this is like the 80s, and these are wealthy white girls in the South, and they are racist and they are homophobic, but it also points out how fucking problematic that was, even if it was a thing of the time. And that's, a lot of authors like don't bother to do that. They're just like, oh, this is how these girls would have behaved at the time, and it's just of the time. So I'm not going to say anything about how awful this was because, you know, that's the point of time that it takes place in. Or they'll sugarcoat it and just like leave all that stuff out, which if it were a choice for me for the two, I would rather them leave it out. The fact that Grady Hendrix puts all of this problematic context in the book, but then goes on to say how problematic this is through the characters without interrupting the story is what really, really makes this a fantastic read. It's like where we can idolize the 80s, but also realize that it's not, like the past is not as bright and shiny as a lot of people make it out to be. So, highly recommend. It's a good time with also a good message. Next up at number 2, this one's kind of off the wall for me because it's a graphic novel, and that's Saga by Brian K. Vaughan. I read all of Saga, and I'm just gonna say the compendium is what I am doing here because there wasn't any individual scene or individual comic that was so much better than the other ones, so I'm gonna say just the whole Saga compendium, the whole story so far is what I put at number 2 here. This is crude and it's hilarious, beautifully drawn, full frontal nudity of men, women, alien spiders, tentacle creatures, not for the soft of heart. There's a lot of cussing, but it's also a love story. And the two main characters in this book are basically two people from warring races, and they are supposed to instinctively hate each other, but they kind of end up falling in love. But it's not a Romeo and Juliet story because they don't off themselves. They actually end up having a baby and then going on the run. And basically the whole book is told about them from the perspective of their adult child. While it's a sad story, it's very emotional, very moving, but it's also, like I said, hilarious and graphically offensive at times. But I very, very much enjoyed this in the combination of touching story and comical porn. And number 1, my very favorite book of 2021 is something that I would have never picked up if it wasn't for a book box, which justifies all the books that I hate that I've gotten out of book boxes that I keep reading and complaining about, and that is The Past is Red by Catherine Valenti. And this is a novella, and again, like, obviously my taste leans towards this is a very weird freaking book with an unlikable female protagonist. And in this universe, it's a futuristic dystopian. The world as we know it doesn't exist anymore, and the ice caps have melted and there is no land left. Does this sound like the plot of Waterworld? Yes, it does, but a little bit weirder than that. Society, or humanity, did survive. Very, very small groups of humanity that survive, and different cultures live in different places, but they're all like floating masses. Whether it's a ship, aircraft carriers, rafts of some sort, or in the case of the main character, some of humanity has fled to the giant trash heap in the Pacific Ocean and made it into a floating landmass, and that's where they live. She is kind of an exile, and thank you. And she is hated by everybody, like passionately hated, to the point where they show up at her house and beat the shit out of her. But she has this like undeniably sunny outlook on life for no reason. And you've got the weirdness of why she's so happy and kind and positive in the face of just overwhelming adversary, and then the fact that her understanding of our civilization is based on our trash. And you just kind of follow her through this whimsical adventure and kind of secondhand discover what has happened to civilization, and her specifically, why she's so hated. And it's just a beautiful little novella that's so extremely weird yet extremely positive when it has really no right to be positive at all. But I adored this book. It reminds me very much of The Slow Regard for Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. So if you've read that book and you really like it, you will probably like this book. If you read that book and you really hate it, you'll probably hate this book. I love The Slow Regard for Silent Things, even though apparently most people didn't. Anyway, that is my top 10 books of 2021. Tell me what your favorite book that you read this year is down in the comments, and then let me know if you think I should read it. But I will catch you in tomorrow's video where we do the statistics, all of the numbers. We'll see if I can count. Who knows? Probably not.